Friends, we spent the last two videos rebuilding this Conqueror Mark II from Dragon and then giving it a heavily worn, rusted out finish, all done with an airbrush and chipping fluid. This surface is the perfect foundation for weathering effects, and those will be the topic of tonight's video, so let's get right into it. Alright, so I have the painted Conqueror, but where do I even start? Here's a small secret: when in doubt, start with a pin wash. Everyone has their own preferred way of weathering models, right? Some like to start with filters or oil dots, some with a pin wash, others like to paint all the details first. There's no right and wrong, whatever suits you is the best path. I personally like to switch things around. Sometimes I get all of the acrylic painting out of the way, such as chipping, detail painting, stowage, and figures. Other times I go down the more traditional path. With this model, I knew for certain that it would need two very important steps: a dry brush and a pin wash. I wanted to start with the dry brushing method, but I quickly realized that the lack of crispness and definition on this chaotic surface would make me try to overdo the effect, so to play it safe, a pin wash was the most logical starting point. I'm using the Winter Streaking Grime from AK, which is not originally intended as a wash, but I really like it. You gotta thin it down with a few drops of thinner, and then it turns into this really nice, not too bright, not too dark, dirty, grimy color. I used it on a few previous models because most of my washes have dried out, and I've been lazy recently to mix them from oil paints, but if something works, then why not to use it? Of course, oils and enamels behave differently and both have their benefits, but when I compare them as a user experience, working with oils is like dedication. You prep them on a piece of cardboard, wait a few hours until the oil drains, and then you start painting. And you gotta keep painting because they're constantly getting drained by that cardboard palette, and after a certain point, depending on the type of oil paint, they'll dry out, or it will affect their blending abilities. If you never experienced an oil paint drying faster than acrylics, you haven't used a 12-hour-old dry palette full of drained oil paints. Because of this, enamels are more shake and bake. You just open them up and they're ready to go at any moment. This means you can go away from your workbench at any point, get back to it later after a few hours, open the bottle, and the paint will behave exactly the same. This is something I started to appreciate deeply in recent months when I'm constantly distracted by other tasks while I'm remodeling my house and building models at the same time. Pretty much every day, that's my daily life. So here's the model after the pin washing treatment. All of a sudden, the worn down, rusty mess has a shape, as in every detail is nicely outlined and visible, and the tank doesn't look so chaotic anymore. This isn't helpful just from the model standpoint, but it gives you, the modeler, a better understanding of every corner of the model. Okay, so let's get to the dry brushing part. Acrylics are ideal for this, and what dry brushing means is loading the brush with paint and unloading most of it on a napkin until the brush is almost completely dry. Duh! It's one of the most old-school methods in our hobby, yet it still has its uses to this day, and I don't mean it as, yeah, it's a pretty lame method but good enough for total beginners. No, not at all. What I mean is that it still has a legit place amongst all the advanced techniques out there. In this case, I went the opposite way, and unlike the traditional definition of this technique, where you use lighter paint to bring out small surface details and edges of the model, I went with a dark rust color, the one I normally use for chipping. The worn, rusty base coat I painted in the previous episode was fine, but it was lacking some finesse. Darkening the edges, outlining the shape of every detail, making the rust look deeper and more interesting. You can put any description to it, that's what was my intention here. It was interesting to observe how the model kept changing during this process, but in a very subtle way. Also, I barely used this method, so it was interesting to realize how many effects you can create. For example, emphasizing the cast texture on certain parts was a very interesting experience. Well, it is undeniable how it makes each part of the model look sharper, and that's what I meant at the beginning. If I started with this technique, I'd be trying to compensate for the lack of crispness by overdoing this step, only to then realize that the model became extremely dark after I finished the pin wash. I can't not mention that this is a pretty quick technique, but when you're working on a massive model like this, it will take a while. It might have taken me good 3 hours to dry brush the entire tank, but I'd be lying if I said those weren't 3 pleasant hours. In fact, the model was starting to look pretty good, and for a moment I thought about keeping it like this, painting the tracks and calling it done, because it kinda resembled what I saw in reference pictures, but hey, why stop the fun so early? So like I said, these two steps made a messy looking model look messy but sharp at the same time. The pin wash outlined the details around their corners, while the dry brush did the outlining around the edges. It also improved the rust in some places where the hairspray chipping was getting hard to control, or I simply couldn't reach those places easily. For example, the gun barrel was kinda strange and boring, because it's really tough to hairspray chip round and smooth surfaces, but some careful dry brushing gave it a more authentic look. I could go on forever showing you close-ups of the model, but let's push forward instead. And the next thing we're gonna treat real quick is weld beads, using a silver color. This is a traditional method of mine that I use on almost every tank. Welds on armor can stay nice and shiny for decades, and they create sweet contrast on any kind of model, be it a dirty operational tank or a rotting, rusty Hulk. It's especially satisfying when you spend hours sculpting your own welds from epoxy putty, and now you're making them shine, so to say. Again, this is actually two techniques working together. The pin wash outlines their texture, while the silver chipping highlights it. Okay, so that was pretty quick, and the next step is gonna be Rastification 2.0 with enamel rust effects. Now, one might think that a rusty tank is gonna need 2 metric tons of rust effects, but the truth is, it only needs less than 1. As I already learned on the rusty Volkswagen Beetle, most of the work has already been carried out with the airbrushed base coat, and to my surprise, rusty vehicles don't have that many rust streaks running down their sides. It's just large areas of rusted metal with some subtle rust bleeding into the chipped paint. Putting that theory into practice, I focused the enamel rust zones around edges, where they nicely complement the dark dry brushing, then around details where it creates more contrast between the individual components of the tank, and sometimes in random shapes over the faded green paint. Here it creates that transition between paint and exposed metal. It's that rust bleeding into the paint that we can often see in photographs. Lighter tones, made using the light rust wash, were mostly applied on wheels and sheet metal components, distinguishing them from the thick armor plates. On a slightly different note, rust always has a flat texture, and that's very important. Nothing subtracts from the authentic appearance of the model more than glossy rust, or even worse, glossy dust. Enamels those days are pretty high quality and reliable, but my model of streaking rust effects, that darker one, is several years old, and to be fair, it kinda shows in its performance. I have to shake it really well and even stir the paint in a palette after a while because the pigment settles down really fast. But not even that prevents the effect from drying into a glossy finish sometimes. Really inconvenient if you ask me, especially when 80% of your model is just rust. I mean, it's nothing a quick blast of flat varnish wouldn't fix, but it means extra work, so I gotta buy a new bottle very soon. Okay, at this stage I was even more tempted to consider the model finished, but then again, it's missing the tracks, and rust always attracts dust. So yeah, we still got a bunch of stuff to paint. I treated the tracks in the previous episode with VMS Black Track Pro 2.0, turning the shiny metal into a super flat, corroded surface. They were too dark for my needs though, so I started by giving them a generous coat of very diluted hollow red, the same paint I used on the tank. There's always some dust and dirt caught in the tracks, even on a stationary abandoned vehicle, so this was quickly sorted with a light coat of very diluted buff. It's better to build up the effect slowly in multiple thin layers than overdoing it with a thick one. Texture and corrosion were added using the speckling method and with the same rust enamels I used moments ago. Enamels have very low surface tension, so they're more ideal for these random splotches than, let's say, acrylics. The contact surface on the inner side was painted using the light rust wash. This is where the track gets polished by road wheels, and then it quickly turns into a bright, rusty tone. And the outer contact points were dry brushed with the dark rust acrylic paint, just like on the tank. Overall, a pretty quick and clean job. The tracks looked okay after this treatment, at least good enough so I could put them on the model. But before I could do that, though, the lower hull needed a quick round of pre-dusting. Reference images show that these hulks get a bit dusty, especially towards the bottom. Probably, I don't know, probably from getting towed around in the dirt all the time or something. Anyway, it was good enough to put the tracks in place, and this gave me a much better idea about the whole model, what it was missing and what needed to be adjusted. First of all, real dirt and natural scatter. I knew from the beginning that the bent fender would have random clumps of dirt on it. This effect is slightly visible in one reference photo I found, and it will nicely add to the abandoned look of the model. I wanted to add some moss as well, but it might be actually a better idea to add it later once I construct the diorama. That way I'll still have some options on how to integrate the tank into the groundwork. Anyway, the ballast freeze from VMS that I always use for fixing natural scatter tends to leave some glossy tide marks, but removing the excess glue and water with a large paintbrush knocks the unwanted sheen to a minimum. Once it was fully dry, I sprayed it with very diluted buff. It's become my favorite dust color, and when it's thinned down properly, we're talking like 80% thinner, you can create pretty nice dust effects with just an airbrush. However, it's easy to go overboard and tone down the rusty finish too much, so don't get carried away. I also sprayed it on the tracks because they were too rusty and didn't match the model. Not to mention, they didn't look like the real thing either. However, it was just the extra dust that was missing, so I quickly dry brushed the contact points again, and the result was much more authentic and satisfying. Sometimes you just have to go back and forth, especially when painting different components of the tank. They might look good on their own, but once you put it all together, sometimes they just don't click together. Finishing touches were carried out with two enamel paints, Earth from Ammo, that's the actual name of the paint, and Winter Streaking Rime. I used these to add more texture to the piles of dirt, but also to tone down some of the airbrushed pre-dusting. Again, the real thing is dusty, but not too dusty like a functional tank. And also, I actually find this pretty important, darker earth colors portray that rotting, abandoned look better than dry dust tones. Of course, you can make an Iraqi T-55 in the desert covered in moss and grime, but the wet British climate is the perfect setting for this look. Well, once that was out of the way, I gave the model a long, overly critical stare, trying to find something totally out of place or, on the opposite end, missing. But you know what? I couldn't find anything, so cue the barn door. Anyway, dear friends, finishing one of the biggest tanks I ever built in just 3 episodes might come off as a surprise, especially considering how tricky its paint job was, and you know what? I'm surprised as well, even more surprisingly because I painted the tank in like 7 days, and those of you with a critical eye might say that it shows. But hey, honestly, I'm pretty happy with the result. It could have been much better if I added more effects, like more grime and the fire damage I mentioned in the previous video, but on the other, it could have been much worse. The reason behind all of this is that my current situation gives me 3 days to work on models and film the process, 1 day to edit the video, and the remaining 3 days to work on my house so I can get this renovation finished before Christmas. Yep, I'm gonna bother you with this in every video for a while longer, but anyway, as I was painting the tank, I formed a pretty clear idea about the diorama, and I think it'll have a building as well. I'll try not to rush it and at the same time keep up with the weekly schedule, I promise. So anyway, thank you for watching my friends, and thank you to my awesome patrons who make this show possible. If you like what I'm doing, want to get more of it, and in return support my work, you can go to my Patreon page and see what kind of reward would you like. I'm posting there almost every day with updates for my workbench. We can get in touch through DMs, comments and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos so you could watch the styrofoam building, I guess. I also have some small 3D models for detailing your models and dioramas. A bunch of references from the real world if you need inspiration for old buildings, landscapes and so on, and these beautiful studio photos which you can download in full resolution. Alright, dear friends, I guess this was an exercise in finishing a rusty tank in the shortest amount of time possible, and you know what? Even if deep down you know that you could make the model at least twice as exciting, it still feels good to get another model finished in a relatively short amount of time, because quantity has a quality all its own or something, right? Well, enough rambling. You all stay safe, stay awesome, build your models, don't just collect them, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!